In this video, we're going to look at a real overview of UIL feature writing. And the reason I say an overview is because I have extensive set of lesson videos about the actual feature writing process outside of UIL. And I recommend looking at those for really the details of how to write a great feature story. But there are things to know specifically about this UIL feature writing competition before you head into it to keep in mind. First of all, you need to know the process of writing a feature story. You need to know the structure of a feature story and the purpose of a feature story. And again, for that, I recommend looking at some of these other videos on feature writing. But let's start with the prompt, okay? So we're going to look at the prompt here, and as always, there's a little bit of instructions here for you on the side. It's telling you that you are a reporter for the Leaguetown Press. It's a student newspaper for Leaguetown High Schools. You do not need to mention Leaguetown anywhere in your feature story because it's assumed that you're writing for that, unless it talks about a bunch of other high schools too, in which you would need to name Leaguetown. From the information that they give you, you're going to write a feature story as you would for the high school newspaper. You may use statements attributed to individuals as direct quotes or indirect quotes. You may not change the meaning of a statement, and you have 1 hour for this writing. Notice that's a little more than any of the others because feature writing is really, in my opinion, one of the most in-depth and useful and common forms of story writing that journalism students are going to do. Again, on this one, you don't write your name or the name of your school. You just use the number that they assign you. And this prompt looks eerily a lot like the news writing prompt, okay? You have some basic information up here, kind of giving you the lay of the land for the story, what's interesting about it, and some information. Some of it you'll need, some of it you will not. And then has the interviews done for you. Here's one interview. Notice how extensive this is. You're going to pull some stuff from that, but not all of it. Here's that same interview continued. Here's an interview with the subject's mom, a classmate, the English teacher, and they even give you some additional information. So the first thing that you've got to determine in this feature story is what is your angle going to be, and what information are you going to use, and what do you not need. You've got to do that pretty quickly while you're kind of reading through the prompt the first time. You've got to make some decisions. You've also got to look at these interviews and decide what quotes really need to be quoted directly because they add a lot of texture and flavor and give us more of an idea about what our subjects and sources are about, which parts of the quotes are powerful, and which do you not need so much directly quoted that you could paraphrase or indirectly quote, or even that you don't need at all. You don't need that information. There's a really good video that shows you kind of how to do this in depth. An example actually with this prompt in the other feature writing videos, and I recommend you take a look at that. The other thing you need to remember is this is the feature writing competition, and they will try to trick you into writing a news story, so don't fall for it. They do the same thing in the news writing competition. They try to get you to write a feature story, try to throw you off with some details, and entice you to maybe write it a different way like you would for a news story, and vice versa. Make sure you have the guts to cut stuff out, too. You don't need everything on here. Use what you need to tell a good, accurate, true story, and don't be afraid to leave some stuff out. So let's take a look at what a winning response looks like. Let's look at this winning response here from a student sample story. The number one thing the judges are going to look at is your feature lead right here. So this is our feature lead. It's a completely different thing from a news lead, so make sure you know the difference. For details on writing a really great feature lead, make sure to check out the video about writing feature leads. But I'll say this. The purpose of a feature lead is to draw your audience in and make them want to know more. It is not the introduction to an essay you're writing in your English class. Those are written for teachers to read, and your poor teachers, they're usually really boring, and they talk about a definition, or they talk in these really universal terms like, life is so hard, and that's why we need to have a capitalist government. Do not write a boring lead. If they read your first 2 to 3 sentences, and it sounds like an essay, goodbye, you're on the bottom half of the stack. Instead, I like to say your first 2 to 3 sentences should read like a movie script in a feature story. I should be able to see what you're saying. You should show me and don't tell me. Don't tell me about the subject. Show me a scene from their life. Tell it like you're telling a story. Look at this one. On the second morning of winter break, Junior Diego Santo was jostled awake when his golden retriever Jester started slobbering all over his face. Not exactly the most pleasant way to wake up. I immediately have a very specific mental picture in mind. But in this case, it was the safest. And now I want to know more. It's that simple. There's a lot of ways to do this. One of the popular ways to describe this is describe the dramatic moment or setting or scene that you're going to be talking about later in the article. Describe that as if you're a fly on the wall seeing it. And if you can do that in 1, 2, maybe 3 sentences, a powerful little snapshot, your reader is going to want to know more. So make sure you have a powerful feature lead, because that's the number one thing the judges are going to read, and they're going to make stacks of the top articles and the bottom articles based on the feature lead. The feature lead is followed by this 1 to 2 sentences, which is the nut graph. The nut graph is the nuts and bolts of the story. This is where you enter the news questions. You answer all the news questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. It basically almost functions like a news lead where you're giving the audience all the information up front. Except that sometimes it can have a little more flair to it than a news lead. If you're not sure what that looks like or how to do that, make sure to watch the other videos on feature story writing, so particularly the one about the nut graph. From there, you're going to notice a familiar pattern, which should be a familiar pattern. You have a quote, and you have a summary or transition. You have a quote, you have a summary or transition, you have a quote, and it goes on and on and on. As you can see here, it goes on and on and on like that till the end, where you end on a quote. You can see we can go up this way and see the same thing. Make sure you don't stack quotes. You always need a summary or transition between quotes. Now, you can have multiple sentence quotes from the same person, but you cannot stack those quotes. There has to be transitions between this idea here and this idea from someone else here. Make sure you do that. Make sure your quotes, you generally don't want quotes to go beyond 3 sentences unless they're really short sentences. And make sure your quotes are in the correct format. Notice also how many paragraphs there are in a feature story. Basically, every new quote is in a new paragraph. Every transition is in its own paragraph. We love paragraphs in journalism, lots and lots of paragraphs. You're not going to do well if you have one big block of text or just 3 big blocks of text. Make sure everything's in its own paragraph. Let's look at the proper way to do a quote. You're going to start the quote with a quotation mark, go into the first sentence they said, and if it's 1 sentence long, that's fine. But if it's more than 1 sentence, it looks like this. You put the comma, you put the close quote, last name, said, period. If it's the first time you're introducing this person, you would need to do their title, first name, and last name. But after that, it's always just the last name. And if you had a 1 sentence long quote, that's what it would look like. If you have a more than 1 sentence long quote, it looks the same way for the first sentence. But then you just put a space, put another quotation mark, and continue what they said. Well, we want that attribution to come after the first sentence, and then you just finish the quote, punctuation, close quotation. Okay, that's how you do it. As long as it's all from the same speaker, if they said multiple sentences, make sure to put this attribution, who said it, early on after the first sentence. Okay, you'll notice that pattern repeated here. You've got the comma, Ruddish said, and then they continue talking till the end here, and then the quotes close again. A few things to think about with these feature writing articles. There are usually so many potential things to quote from this prompt. There's so many potential things you could quote from so many people that it could really be problematic if you try to quote too many. So make sure you're only selecting quotes that advance the theme of your story, that really add to the story. Now, we want to hear from multiple sources, right? You want to hear from at least 3 of these different people interviewed, if not more. But you don't have to have everybody, and you don't have to have everything they said. So it's important to keep that in mind. Remember, don't be afraid to cut out things that don't need to be there. And remember that the backbone of your story are the best quotes. Your job as a feature story writer is to let the people in the story speak for themselves and tell their own story in their own words whenever possible. Okay? If you've got particularly weak quotes, you don't need to directly quote them. You can use that as a paraphrase, or those even work as really good transitions, taking the information they give you and using it as an appropriate transition between some other quotes. So that's a little hack there for you as well. And the last thing to remember about the feature writing article is that you never, ever, ever use your opinion in this. You can quote the opinion of your subjects and sources if you want, but you keep your opinion out of it, okay? Don't say that someone is great. You can quote someone else saying that they're great, but even that is editorializing. Make sure not to do that. That should be a good overview for you of the feature writing competition for UIL. Again, there's an extensive set of videos on writing a great feature story, since this is such a common thing we do in scholastic journalism. It might be a good practice to review the one about nut graphs and leads and the one about transitions, so you really have your head on straight going into this competition. Good luck.